When I walked into that courtroom on a Tuesday morning in September, I was wearing my best black suit, the one that cost more than most people make in a month. My heels clicked against the marble floor with the confidence of someone who had built an empire from nothing. But the moment Judge Marcus Webb looked up from his papers and saw my face, everything changed. He froze completely. His pen slipped from his fingers and clattered onto his desk. The color drained from his face as if he'd seen a ghost. In a whisper that somehow carried across the silent courtroom, he said, "It can't be." Sarah Martinez? Every person in that room turned to stare at me. The city attorney looked confused. The court reporter stopped typing. The security guard shifted uncomfortably. But I just smiled and said in the calmest voice I could manage, "It's Sarah Chen now, Your Honor. My name is Sarah Chen, and I am 45 years old." To everyone in that courtroom, I was just another successful businesswoman fighting the city over a development project. They saw my expensive clothes, my confident posture, my team of high-powered lawyers. What they didn't know was that 20 years ago, I had stood in that same courthouse as a broken 25-year-old single mother, wearing a cheap dress from a thrift store, about to be sentenced to 8 years in prison for a crime I didn't commit. But Judge Webb knew. Judge Webb remembered. "You see, I'm the CEO of Chen Technologies, a company worth $50 million. We build affordable housing for people who need second chances. People like I used to be. I have offices in 12 cities, over 300 employees, and a reputation for being tough but fair in business. The media calls me a success story, a woman who built something from nothing. If only they knew how right they were about the nothing part. 20 years ago, I wasn't Sarah Chen. I was Sarah Martinez, a young woman who came to this country with nothing but dreams and a fierce love for my 5-year-old daughter, Elena. I worked 3 jobs while studying law at night, saving every penny so I could attend law school and give Elena the life she deserved. I finally caught a break when I got hired as a paralegal at Blackwood and Associates, a respected law firm downtown. The pay was good, the work was steady, and for the first time since Elena was born, I could breathe. I thought I was building a foundation for our future. I had no idea I was walking into a trap. Richard Blackwood, the senior partner, was a smooth-talking man in his 50s who everyone respected. He drove expensive cars, wore tailored suits, and handled the biggest cases in the city. What I didn't know was that he was stealing from client accounts, using my computer access codes to cover his tracks. The day my world collapsed started like any other. I dropped Elena off at daycare, went to work, and was organizing files when the FBI agents walked through the door. They weren't there for Blackwood. They were there for me. "Sarah Martinez, you're under arrest for embezzlement and fraud." I still remember the feeling of those handcuffs clicking around my wrists, the way Elena screamed when they took me away from the daycare center, the look of disgust on my neighbors' faces when the news reported that the young single mother from apartment 4B was a criminal. The evidence against me was overwhelming. Bank records showing transfers from client accounts to accounts in my name. Computer logs showing my access codes were used for unauthorized transactions. $200,000 had been stolen, and every digital fingerprint pointed to me. But I was innocent. My court-appointed lawyer was fresh out of law school and overwhelmed. He barely looked at the evidence. He pushed me to take a plea deal, saying fighting would only make things worse. But I refused. I knew I was innocent, and I believed the truth would come out. I was wrong. The trial was a joke. Judge Marcus Webb, the same man who had just recognized me in that courtroom, rushed through the proceedings like he had somewhere better to be. When my lawyer tried to present evidence that someone else had access to the system, Webb shut him down. When we found a witness who had seen Blackwood working late on the nights the money was transferred, Webb ruled the testimony irrelevant. In less than 2 weeks, I was convicted on all charges. Webb sentenced me to 8 years in prison without even looking at me. Just like that, my life was over. Elena was placed with my elderly Aunt Maria, the only family I had left. As they led me away in shackles, I caught sight of Blackwood in the gallery. He wasn't celebrating, but there was relief in his eyes. Relief that his scapegoat had taken the fall. Prison changed me. Not in the way most people think. I didn't become hard or bitter. I became determined. I spent every free hour in the prison library studying law, business, anything I could get my hands on. I earned my bachelor's degree through correspondence courses, then started on my master's. But more importantly, I started investigating. I wrote letters, made phone calls during my allowed time, and slowly began to uncover the truth. Blackwood hadn't just framed me. Over the years, he had done the same thing to 2 other women. All of us were single mothers. All of us had no resources to fight back. All of us had been convicted in Judge Webb's courtroom. The pattern was clear, but from prison, there was nothing I could do about it. I served 6 years before getting an early release for good behavior. When I walked out of those prison gates, I was 31 years old with a criminal record and $53 to my name. Elena was 11 and barely remembered me. Worse, my Aunt Maria had filled her head with stories about how I had brought shame to the family. But I had something now that I didn't have when I went in: knowledge, determination, and a plan. Now, 20 years later, I was back in that courtroom. Not as a victim this time, but as someone with power. Someone who could finally expose the truth and get justice for all of us who had been wronged. Judge Webb's hands were shaking as he tried to compose himself. He cleared his throat and said, "Mrs. Chen, I assume you're here about the development case?" "Yes, Your Honor," I replied, never breaking eye contact. Among other things, the city attorney, a young man who clearly had no idea what was happening, stood up. "Your Honor, my client is prepared to present our case against Mrs. Chen's improper use of eminent domain laws." I almost laughed. If they only knew what I was really here for. "Very well," Webb said, his voice still shaky. "Let's proceed." But as I took my seat at the defendant's table next to my lawyer, I caught Webb's eye one more time. In that moment, he knew exactly why I was there. He knew that after 20 years, Sarah Martinez had come back for him. And this time, I wasn't the powerless young mother he had railroaded into prison. This time, I had the resources to fight. This time, I was going to win. The bailiff called the court to order, and my lawyer stood to give her opening statement. But I was barely listening. All I could think about was how long I had waited for this moment. How many nights had I dreamed of the day I would walk back into this courtroom and show them all who I really was. That day had finally come. Before I tell you what happened in that courtroom, you need to understand how completely they destroyed my life. Because that's what this story is really about. It's not just about money or corruption. It's about what happens when the system meant to protect innocent people becomes the weapon used to destroy them. When I started working at Blackwood and Associates, I thought I had finally caught a break. After years of working multiple jobs, cleaning offices at night, and waiting tables during the day, while Elena slept at the babysitter's, I had landed a real job. A job with benefits, with a future. I was so grateful to Richard Blackwood for hiring me. He was this distinguished man with silver hair and expensive suits, always talking about justice and helping people. The other paralegals warned me he could be demanding, but I didn't care. I was used to working hard. What I didn't know was that Blackwood had specifically chosen me because I fit a profile. Young, desperate, with no family connections or resources to fight back if things went wrong. He had done this before, and he would do it again after me. For 6 months, everything seemed perfect. I learned the computer system, organized case files, and even helped with research on some of the bigger cases. Blackwood praised my work and hinted that the firm might help pay for law school if I continued to excel. Elena was thriving in a better daycare program, and for the first time since her father left us, I felt like we had a real future. Then the FBI came. The lead agent, a woman named Detective Rodriguez, seemed almost apologetic as she read me my rights. "Mrs. Martinez, you're being charged with embezzling $200,000 from client accounts. The evidence shows systematic theft over 6 months using your computer access codes." I remember laughing. Actually laughing. It was so absurd, so impossible that my brain couldn't process it as real. "There's been a mistake," I kept saying. "I would never steal anything. I don't even understand how the accounting system works." But as they led me through the office in handcuffs, I saw the faces of my coworkers. The suspicion, the disappointment. And in the corner, Richard Blackwood stood with his arms crossed, shaking his head like he was personally betrayed by my actions. The evidence they showed me was devastating. Bank statements for accounts I had never seen, bearing my name and social security number. Computer logs showing my access codes had been used to transfer money at all hours, including times when I was supposedly at home with Elena. Forged documents with my signature authorizing the transfers. My public defender, a tired-looking man named James Murphy, took one look at the evidence and urged me to plea bargain. "Sarah, they have you dead to rights," he said during our first meeting. "The best we can hope for is a reduced sentence if you cooperate." "But I didn't do it," I insisted. "Someone is framing me." He sighed like he'd heard this 1,000 times before. "They always say that. Look, I've been doing this for 15 years. The prosecution doesn't bring cases like this unless they're sure they can win. Your best bet is to take the deal." But I couldn't accept a deal for something I didn't do. So we went to trial. From the moment I walked into Judge Webb's courtroom, I felt like the outcome was predetermined. Webb barely looked at me during jury selection. When Murphy tried to argue that someone else could have used my access codes, Webb sustained every objection from the prosecution. When we found a security guard who remembered seeing Blackwood in the office during several of the nights when money was transferred, Webb ruled his testimony inadmissible due to a technicality. The prosecution painted me as a greedy single mother who saw an opportunity and took it. They brought in character witnesses who talked about how I always seemed to be struggling with money, how I had asked about overtime pay and advancement opportunities. They made my ambitions sound like evidence of guilt. Meanwhile, Murphy barely put up a defense. He called a few character witnesses who said I was a good person, but he never challenged the technical evidence. He never brought in computer experts to examine the access logs. He never questioned why someone stealing money would be stupid enough to put it in accounts bearing their own name. The trial lasted 8 days. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When the foreman read the verdict, I felt my legs give out. Guilty on all charges. Elena, who was sitting in the gallery with my Aunt Maria, started crying. I turned to look at her, this little girl who was about to lose her mother, and I saw her confusion and fear. Judge Webb scheduled sentencing for the following week. During those 7 days, I tried desperately to figure out what had happened. I called Murphy constantly, begging him to file an appeal or investigate further. But he was already moving on to his next case. The morning of sentencing, I dressed carefully in the only nice outfit I owned, a navy blue dress I had bought for job interviews. Elena wasn't allowed in the courtroom this time, but I could hear her crying in the hallway. Judge Webb didn't even look at me as he read my sentence. "Sarah Martinez, you have been found guilty of embezzling $200,000 from client accounts." This was a serious breach of trust that harmed innocent people. The court sentences you to 8 years in state prison, followed by 5 years of probation. You are ordered to pay full restitution of $200,000 plus court costs. 8 years. Years. Elena would be 13 when I got out. I would miss her childhood, her first day of middle school, her first dance. Everything I had worked for, everything I had dreamed of was gone. As the bailiff led me away, I caught sight of Richard Blackwood one more time. He was talking to someone in the hallway, and for just a moment, our eyes met. There was no sympathy there, no regret, just cold satisfaction that his problem had been solved. Prison was harder than I expected and easier than I feared. The other inmates weren't the monsters the movies made them out to be. Most were women like me, people who had made mistakes or been failed by the system. I kept my head down, followed the rules, and spent every free moment in the library. That's where I discovered the truth about what had happened to me. It started with a computer class that the prison offered. As I learned more about how digital systems worked, I began to understand how someone could have used my access codes without my knowledge. A simple keylogger program could have captured my passwords. Administrative access could have created the fake bank accounts in my name. But the real breakthrough came when I started researching other cases. During my second year in prison, I read a newspaper article about another woman who had been convicted of embezzlement from a different law firm. Her story sounded familiar. Young single mother, computer access codes used to steal money, quick trial, harsh sentence. I started digging deeper. Through legal databases available in the prison library, I found two more similar cases. All four of us were young women with children. All of us had worked for law firms. All of us had been convicted in Judge Marcus Webb's courtroom within a span of 5 years. The pattern was unmistakable. I wrote letters to these other women, or rather, to their families, since they were all still in prison. Slowly, a picture emerged. In each case, there had been a senior partner at the law firm who had access to the same systems. In each case, the evidence against us had appeared almost overnight, as if someone had been preparing it in advance. In each case, Judge Webb had rushed the trials and refused to allow evidence that might have pointed to other suspects. But the most shocking discovery came in my 4th year of prison. I was researching Webb's background when I found out that he and Richard Blackwood had been roommates in college. They had belonged to the same fraternity, attended each other's weddings, and had maintained a friendship for over 30 years. Webb hadn't just been negligent in my trial. He had been actively helping his friend destroy innocent women to cover up his crimes. I started keeping detailed records of everything I discovered. I wrote letters to legal aid organizations, to journalists, to anyone who might listen. But from prison with a criminal record, I had no credibility. My letters were ignored or dismissed as the desperate claims of a convicted felon. So I changed my approach. Instead of trying to prove my innocence from prison, I decided to prepare for the day I got out. I earned my bachelor's degree in business administration, then started working on my master's degree in computer science. I studied every aspect of the legal system that had failed me. I learned about evidence preservation, about statute of limitations, and about how to build an airtight case. Most importantly, I learned about money. Because I realized that, in America, money was the only thing that gave you real power to fight injustice. Elena visited me exactly 4 times during my 6 years in prison. Each visit was more painful than the last. She had grown from a confused 5-year-old into an angry preteen who blamed me for abandoning her. My Aunt Maria had told her that I was a criminal who had disgraced the family. Elena believed it. During our last visit, when she was 11 years old, she looked me in the eye and said, "I wish you weren't my mother." Those words broke something in me that I thought was already completely broken. But they also gave me focus. I couldn't get those years back, but I could make sure that someday Elena would understand the truth. Someday, she would be proud of who her mother really was. I was released after serving 6 years of my sentence. The parole officer who processed me out looked at my file with surprise. College graduate, clean disciplinary record, multiple certificates in computer programming, he read. Don't see that often. You've got a real chance to make something of yourself. If only he knew what I was planning. The day I walked out of prison, I had $53, a bag of clothes, and a head full of knowledge about the corruption that had destroyed my life. I also had something else, a burning determination to make sure it never happened to anyone else. But first, I had to rebuild my life. And then, when I was strong enough, I was going to come back for Judge Marcus Webb and everyone who had helped him destroy innocent people. That rebuilding took 20 years. But now, sitting in that courtroom, seeing the fear in Webb's eyes, I knew it had all been worth it. Walking out of prison with $53 and a criminal record was like being thrown into a world that had moved on without me. Elena was 11 now, living with my Aunt Maria in a different neighborhood. She barely looked at me when I showed up at the door. Elena, your mother is here, Maria called, her voice cold with judgment. My daughter appeared in the hallway, taller now, with the serious expression of a child who had grown up too fast. She looked me up and down, taking in my prison-issued clothes and the plastic bag that contained all my belongings. I don't want to talk to her, Elena said simply, then turned and walked back to her room. Maria crossed her arms. You can't stay here, Sarah. I've got Elena to think about, and she's been through enough. I understood. I didn't argue. I just asked if I could take Elena for dinner sometime when she was ready. Maria said maybe, but her tone suggested never. I found a room at a boarding house downtown, the kind of place where people paid by the week and minded their own business. My room was barely bigger than my prison cell, but it was mine. I had exactly enough money for 2 weeks of rent and maybe 10 days of food if I was careful. The job search was brutal. Every application asked about criminal history. I was honest because lying would only make things worse if they found out. The responses were predictable. We'll call you. We've decided to go with someone else. The position has been filled. After 3 weeks of rejections, I was down to my last $5 when I found a job at a data entry company that hired people with records. The pay was minimum wage. The work was mind-numbing, but it was a start. I typed insurance claims 8 hours a day and studied programming at night using library computers. My first goal was simple: survive. My second goal was bigger: to prove to Elena that her mother wasn't the criminal everyone thought she was. 6 months after my release, I finally got Elena to agree to see me. We met at a McDonald's near her school, a neutral territory where she could leave if she wanted to. She ordered a Happy Meal but barely touched it, just sat there staring at me like I was a stranger. Aunt Maria says you stole money from people, she said finally. I looked at my 11-year-old daughter, this beautiful girl who had my eyes and her father's stubborn chin, and made a decision. I was going to tell her the truth even if she didn't believe me. Elena, I know this is hard to understand, but I didn't steal anything. Someone else took that money and made it look like I did it. She rolled her eyes. That's what all criminals say. You're right, I agreed. But sometimes innocent people get sent to prison too. And when that happens, they have to be very smart and very patient to prove their innocence. So prove it, she challenged. I'm working on it. But it's going to take time. Years, maybe. But I promise you, someday, you're going to know the truth about what really happened. She didn't believe me. I could see it in her face. But she didn't leave either, and when I asked if we could meet again next week, she said, okay. Those weekly dinners became the anchor of my life. Slowly, very slowly, Elena began to open up. She told me about school, about her friends, about the nightmares she used to have when I first went to prison. I told her about the books I was reading, the programming classes I was taking, and the plans I was making for our future. I never lied to her about how hard things were. When I got evicted from the boarding house because I couldn't make rent, I told her I was staying at a shelter for a few weeks. When I had to choose between buying groceries and taking the bus to see her, I explained why I sometimes had to walk the 12 miles to our meetings, but I also never stopped working towards something better. After a year of data entry, I had saved enough money to buy a used laptop. I started taking freelance programming jobs, working on websites and small applications during my evenings and weekends. The pay was better than data entry, and more importantly, it was building towards something. By my second year out of prison, I had taught myself enough programming to land a job at a small software company. The owner, a man named David Kim, was willing to overlook my criminal record because he needed someone with my skills and couldn't afford to pay market rates. I'm taking a chance on you, he told me during my interview. Don't make me regret it. I worked harder for David than I had ever worked for anyone. I stayed late, took on extra projects, and treated every task like my career depended on it. Because it did. It did. Elena was 13 now, and our relationship was slowly improving. She still lived with Maria, but she started spending weekends with me in my tiny one-bedroom apartment. We would work on her homework together, and I would help her with math and science while secretly marveling at how smart she was. One Saturday, she found me working on a programming project at the kitchen table. "What's that?" she asked. "It's a database system for tracking housing applications," I explained. A lot of people who need affordable housing have to apply to dozens of different programs, but there's no central system to track everything. This would help them manage their applications and help housing authorities avoid duplication. Elena studied the screen. "Did someone ask you to build this?" "No," I admitted. "I'm building it because I think it's needed." She looked at me with something I hadn't seen before: respect. That project became my first real breakthrough. I finished the housing application system and pitched it to the City Housing Authority. They loved it and paid me $15,000 for the software plus a monthly maintenance fee. It was the first time since prison that I had money to spare. The first thing I did was move to a bigger apartment in Elena's school district. The second thing I did was start my own company. Chen Technologies began in my living room with one client and one employee, me. But I had learned something crucial during my years of rebuilding. There was a huge need for software solutions that help people navigate complex bureaucratic systems. Housing authorities, social services, and legal aid organizations. They all had the same problem: too many people needing help and not enough tools to manage them efficiently. I focused on building software for organizations that serve people like I used to be. People who were struggling, who needed second chances, who were often ignored by the larger technology companies. The business grew slowly but steadily. After 2 years, I hired my first employee. After 3 years, I had a small office and 5 employees. Elena, now 16, started helping with basic data entry during her summer breaks. But even as my company grew, I never forgot my real purpose. Every success, every new contract, every dollar I earned was ultimately building toward one goal: getting justice for what had been done to me and the other women who had been framed. I continued my research into the corruption that had destroyed my life. I hired private investigators to track down evidence that had been overlooked during my trial. I found the other victims of Blackwood and Webb's scheme and slowly built relationships with them. Most importantly, I learned everything I could about Judge Marcus Webb, his career, his finances, his personal life. I discovered that he was up for nomination to the state Supreme Court. I learned about his gambling debts, his expensive lifestyle, and his friendship with powerful people. And I waited. I waited for the right moment to strike back. By my 10th year out of prison, Chen Technologies was worth $10 million. Elena was in college, studying pre-law, and our relationship was stronger than it had ever been. She still didn't fully believe my story about being framed, but she respected what I had built and was proud of my success. But I wasn't satisfied with success. I wanted justice. That's when I decided to buy the piece of land that would force Judge Webb to hear my case. It was perfect, a valuable development site in his jurisdiction that the city wanted for a public project. If I bought it and refused to sell, they would have to take me to court. And Marcus Webb would have to look me in the eye again. 20 years after he had sent an innocent woman to prison, I was ready to make him answer for what he had done. The moment I had been planning for 20 years had finally arrived. As I sat in that courtroom, watching Judge Webb try to compose himself after recognizing me, I felt a calm satisfaction wash over me. This wasn't about revenge anymore. This was about justice. My lawyer stood to give her opening statement. But what the city attorney didn't know, what Judge Webb was desperately trying not to think about, was that my lawyer was Elena Martinez Chen, my daughter. The 5-year-old girl who had watched her mother being led away in handcuffs had grown up to become one of the most brilliant legal minds in the state. Your Honor, Elena began, her voice clear and confident, my client, Sarah Chen, is here today because the city is attempting to seize her property through eminent domain for a project that serves private interests rather than public good. But this case is about more than just property rights. It's about justice, truth, and holding powerful people accountable for their actions. Webb's knuckles were white as he gripped his gavel. Mrs. Chen, please stick to the matter at hand. Elena smiled, and I saw myself in that smile. Of course, Your Honor. But I believe the court should understand the full context of my client's relationship with this jurisdiction. The city attorney, a young man named Robert Hayes, looked confused. Objection, Your Honor. The defendant's personal history is irrelevant to this eminent domain case. Sustained, Webb said quickly. Too quickly. But Elena was just getting started. Your Honor, my client purchased this property specifically because of her previous experiences in this courthouse. She has a deep understanding of how justice works here. I watched Webb's face turn pale. He knew exactly what Elena was implying, but he couldn't stop her without revealing why he was so nervous. Miss Chen, he said carefully, please limit your remarks to the current case. Of course, Your Honor, Elena replied. But first, I'd like my client to testify about why she chose to invest in this particular piece of land. Hayes stood up. Objection. The defendant's motivations for purchasing the property are not relevant to whether the eminent domain taking is legally justified. Overruled, I said, surprising everyone, including Webb. He had been so focused on trying to shut down Elena's line of questioning that he forgot to sustain the objection. Elena nodded to me, and I stood to take the witness stand. As I walked past Webb's bench, I caught his eye. The fear there was unmistakable. The bailiff swore me in, and I settled into the witness chair. This was the same spot where I had sat 20 years ago as a confused and desperate young woman, trying to convince a jury of my innocence. Now I was back, but everything had changed. Mrs. Chen, Elena began, please tell the court about your company and why you purchased the property in question. I am the CEO of Chen Technologies, I said, speaking clearly so everyone in the courtroom could hear. We specialize in software solutions for affordable housing and social services. I purchased the land on Maple Street because I wanted to build a community center that would provide technology training and legal aid services to people who need second chances. Second chances? Elena asked. Can you elaborate on what you mean by that? This was the moment. I looked directly at Judge Webb. People who have been failed by the system, Miss Chen. People who have been wrongly accused, wrongly convicted, or otherwise treated unjustly by institutions that should have protected them. Webb's hand was shaking as he reached for his water glass. Hayes stood up again. Your Honor, I really must object. The defendant's charitable intentions don't change the fact that the city needs this land for public use. What kind of public use? Elena asked before Webb could respond. A parking structure for the new commercial district, Hayes replied. Elena turned back to me. Mrs. Chen, in your experience, does a parking structure serve the public interest more than a community center providing legal aid and job training? Objection. Hayes called out. That calls for speculation. Sustained, Webb said, but his voice cracked slightly. Elena approached the witness stand. Mrs. Chen, you mentioned people who have been wrongly convicted. Do you have personal experience with such cases? This was it. The moment everything would come out. Yes, I said simply. I do. The courtroom was completely silent. Even Hayes seemed to sense that something bigger was happening here. Can you tell the court about that experience? Elena asked. Webb leaned forward. Miss Chen, I'm going to have to ask you to limit your questions to the matter before the court. Your Honor, Elena replied, my client's previous experience with this justice system is directly relevant to why she chose to make this investment in this jurisdiction. She has a unique understanding of how the law works here. Before Webb could object, I spoke up. 20 years ago, I was wrongfully convicted of embezzlement in this courthouse. I spent 6 years in prison for a crime I didn't commit. The gasp from the gallery was audible. Hayes looked stunned. The court reporter stopped typing and stared at me. But it was Webb's reaction that confirmed everything I had suspected. His face went completely white, and he gripped the edge of his bench like he was trying to keep from falling over. Your Honor, Hayes said weakly, I motion for a recess. This testimony is clearly prejudicial and irrelevant too. Motion denied, Webb said automatically, then seemed to realize what he had said. I mean, we'll take a 15-minute recess. He banged his gavel and practically fled from the courtroom. Elena and I looked at each other. Phase 1 was complete. Webb had confirmed his recognition of me and shown his panic to everyone in the room. Now we just had to wait and see what he would do next. During the recess, Hayes approached our table. What the hell is going on here? He demanded. Are you saying Judge Webb wrongfully convicted your client 20 years ago? I'm not saying anything, Elena replied calmly. My client is simply providing context for her investment decisions. This is insane, Hayes muttered. I need to call my supervisor. As he walked away to make his call, Elena leaned over to me. How are you feeling, Mom? It was the first time she had called me Mom in the courtroom. For a moment, I forgot about Webb, about the case, about everything except the fact that my daughter was here beside me, fighting for truth and justice. Proud, I said softly. So proud of you. When Webb returned from recess, he looked like he had aged 10 years. His hands were still shaking, and he couldn't meet my eyes. The court will come to order, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Elena stood up. Your Honor, I'd like to continue my client's testimony. Actually, Webb said, clearing his throat, I think we should move on to the city's case. The court has heard enough about Mrs. Chen's background. With respect, Your Honor, My client wasn't finished answering my question. Webb looked trapped. If he cut off my testimony too aggressively, it would only make him look more suspicious. But if he let me continue, I might say something that would destroy him. Very well, he said finally. But please keep your questions relevant to the eminent domain issue. Elena turned back to me. Mrs. Chen, you mentioned that you were wrongfully convicted. Was that conviction overturned? No, I said. I served my full sentence. But I never stopped investigating what really happened to me. And what did you discover? This was the moment where I would either reveal everything or save it for later. I looked at Webb, saw the terror in his eyes, and made my decision. I discovered that I wasn't the only one, I said slowly. There were other women, other cases, all with the same pattern. All convicted in this courthouse. The murmur from the gallery was getting louder. Hayes was frantically whispering into his phone, and Judge Webb looked like he was about to have a heart attack. Your Honor, he said suddenly standing up, I need to. That is, I think there may be a conflict of interest here that requires me to recuse myself from this case. Elena and I exchanged glances. This was not what we had expected. If Webb recused himself, it would take months to get a new judge assigned, and we might lose our momentum. Your Honor, Elena said quickly, my client objects to any recusal. She specifically chose to bring this case to your courtroom because of your familiarity with her previous case. She believes you are uniquely qualified to ensure that justice is served this time. The irony was perfect. Webb couldn't recuse himself without admitting why he was afraid to hear the case. But staying would mean facing the exposure of everything he had done. He sat back down heavily. Very well. We'll continue. But I could see in his eyes that he was already planning his escape. This was a man who had spent decades covering up his crimes, and he wasn't going to go down without a fight. Mrs. Chen, Elena continued during your investigation into your wrongful conviction, what did you discover about the judge who sentenced you? Webb's gavel came down hard. Objection sustained. Your Honor, Elena said calmly, there was no objection. Webb realized his mistake. Hayes was staring at him with growing suspicion. The whole courtroom could see that something was terribly wrong. The court finds this line of questioning inappropriate, Webb stammered. Then I'll ask a different question, Elena said. She turned back to me. Mrs. Chen, why did you choose to build your community center in this specific jurisdiction? I looked directly at Judge Webb as I answered. Because this is where my life was destroyed 20 years ago, and this is where I'm going to rebuild it. The tension in the courtroom was electric. Everyone could feel that we were witnessing something much bigger than a simple property dispute. Webb was trapped, and we all knew it. But the real fireworks were just beginning. What happened next will stay with me forever. As I sat in that witness chair, looking at Judge Webb's terrified face, I realized that 20 years of planning had led to this single moment. Elena approached the witness stand with a folder in her hands, and I knew our real evidence was about to be revealed. Mrs. Chen, Elena said during your investigation into your wrongful conviction, did you uncover evidence of a pattern of corruption? Hayes finally found his voice. Your Honor, this is completely inappropriate. We're here about an eminent domain case, not some conspiracy theory about events from 20 years ago. But before Webb could respond, Elena continued. Your Honor, what my client discovered affects the integrity of this entire court system. The public has a right to know. The court will recess, Webb said desperately, starting to stand. Your Honor, Elena said firmly, my client is in the middle of answering a question under oath. Surely the court isn't going to prevent a sworn witness from telling the truth. Webb froze. He was trapped. If he shut down my testimony now, it would look like he was hiding something. But if he let me continue, his career was over. The courtroom was dead silent. Everyone was watching, waiting to see what would happen next. "Continue," Webb said finally, his voice barely audible. Elena nodded to me. This was it. I discovered that between 1999 and 2004, 4 women were convicted of embezzlement in this courthouse. I began. All 4 cases involved law firms. All 4 defendants were single mothers with no resources to fight back. All 4 were sentenced by Judge Marcus Webb. The gasp from the gallery was audible. Hayes dropped his phone. The court reporter looked up from her machine in shock. But most importantly, I continued, I discovered that the senior partners at all 4 law firms had personal connections to Judge Webb. They were friends, former classmates, business associates. Webb's face was now completely white. His hands were shaking so badly that he could barely hold his pen. Elena opened her folder. "Your Honor, I'd like to present evidence to support my client's testimony." "Objection," Hayes shouted. "This evidence should have been disclosed during discovery." "Your Honor," Elena replied, "this evidence relates directly to my client's credibility and her reasons for choosing to invest in this jurisdiction. It's completely relevant to her testimony." Webb looked like he was going to be sick. He knew that if he refused to allow the evidence, it would only make him look more guilty. But if he allowed it, everything would come out. "I'll allow it," he whispered. Elena handed me a document. "Mrs. Chen, can you identify this?" I looked at the paper even though I had memorized every word years ago. "This is a bank record from 2003 showing a deposit of $50,000 into Judge Webb's personal account, made 3 days after my conviction." The explosion of noise from the gallery was immediate. Hayes was on his feet, shouting objections. Webb was pounding his gavel, trying to restore order. But it was too late. The truth was out. "Order," Webb yelled. "Order in this court." But Elena wasn't finished. She handed me another document. "And this? This is a record of Judge Webb's gambling debts from the same time period. He owed over $100,000 to various casinos and bookmakers. And this pattern of payments following convictions, did it occur in the other cases you investigated?" "Yes. Each time one of us was convicted, Judge Webb received a payment of $50,000 within a week of sentencing." Hayes was frantically trying to object, but Webb seemed frozen. He couldn't speak, couldn't move, could barely breathe. Elena pulled out another set of documents. "Mrs. Chen, what did you discover about the evidence used to convict you?" "The bank accounts that were supposedly mine were actually created by someone with administrative access to the law firm's system. The signatures on the documents were forged using samples from my employment paperwork. And the computer logs showing my access codes were manipulated." "How do you know this?" "Because I hired forensic computer experts to analyze the original evidence. What they found was that someone had systematically created false evidence to frame me." Elena held up a thick report. "Your Honor, this is a forensic analysis of the evidence from my client's original case, conducted by 3 independent experts. They all reached the same conclusion: Sarah Martinez was framed." The courtroom erupted again. People were shouting, reporters were making phone calls, and through it all, Judge Webb just sat there looking like a broken man. But I wasn't done yet. Elena handed me one final document, and I knew this was the one that would end everything. "Mrs. Chen, what is this document?" I held up the paper so everyone in the courtroom could see it. "This is a confession letter written by Richard Blackwood before he died of a heart attack 5 years ago. In it, he admits to framing me and the other 3 women. He also admits to paying Judge Webb to ensure our convictions. The silence that followed was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop in that courtroom. He kept this letter in a safety deposit box with instructions that it should be given to the FBI if anything happened to him. His lawyer followed those instructions, but somehow the letter never made it to the authorities. Elena approached the bench. Your Honor, we also have evidence that this confession letter was delivered to the district attorney's office 5 years ago, but was buried to protect certain individuals. That's when Judge Webb finally broke. This court is in recess, he said, his voice cracking. Indefinitely. He stood up so quickly that he knocked over his water glass, sending water cascading over his bench. As he tried to escape through the door behind his chair, his legs gave out and he stumbled. But Elena's voice stopped him cold. Your Honor, there's one more thing. Webb turned around slowly, and I saw a man who knew his life was over. The FBI is waiting outside to speak with you. As if on cue, the courtroom doors opened and 3 federal agents walked in. The lead agent, a woman in a dark suit, approached the bench. Judge Marcus Webb, you're under arrest for conspiracy, bribery, and obstruction of justice. The courtroom exploded into chaos. People were shouting, cameras were flashing, and reporters were rushing to call their newsrooms. But all I could focus on was Webb's face as the handcuffs clicked around his wrists. 20 years. 20 years I had waited for this moment. As the agents led Webb away, he looked at me one last time. There was no defiance left, no arrogance. Just the hollow eyes of a man who had finally been caught. Hayes approached our table, his face pale with shock. I had no idea, he said to Elena. The city did not know of any of this. Elena nodded. We know. This was never about the city. It was about justice. The lead FBI agent approached me as the courtroom slowly cleared. Mrs. Chen, we're going to need your full cooperation in building the case against Judge Webb and the others involved in this conspiracy. You have it, I said without hesitation. As we gathered our papers and prepared to leave, Elena put her hand on my arm. Mom, how does it feel? I thought about that question as we walked out of the courthouse, past the reporters shouting questions, past the crowd of supporters who had somehow learned what was happening. How did it feel to finally expose the truth after 20 years? It feels like I can breathe again, I said finally. But even as I said it, I knew this was just the beginning. Webb's arrest would trigger investigations into dozens of other cases. Other victims would come forward. The corruption we had exposed was deeper than just one judge and a few lawyers. That night, Elena and I sat in my office, surrounded by boxes of evidence and legal documents. The local news was calling it the biggest judicial corruption scandal in the state's history. The national networks were picking up the story. What happens now? Elena asked. Now we make sure this never happens to anyone else, I said. We use everything we've learned, everything we've built, to reform the system that failed us. Elena smiled, and for the first time in 20 years, it wasn't tinged with doubt or pain. I'm proud of you, Mom. I'm proud of what you've done, and I'm proud to be your daughter. Those words meant more to me than all the money I had made, more than all the success I had achieved. My daughter believed in me again. She understood that everything I had done, every sacrifice I had made, had been for justice. But our work wasn't finished. In fact, it was just beginning. The weeks following Judge Webb's arrest were a whirlwind of investigations, interviews, and revelations. What started as my personal quest for justice had uncovered a corruption scandal that reached far beyond what any of us had imagined. Webb's arrest made national headlines. Federal judge arrested in 20-year corruption scheme read the front page of every major newspaper. The story had everything the media love: corruption, betrayal, and an underdog who fought back against impossible odds. But for me, the real satisfaction came from the phone calls. Sarah, this is Maria Gonzalez. I was convicted in Judge Webb's courtroom in 2001. I've been following your story, and I want you to know that you gave me hope for the first time in over 20 years. Mrs. Chen, this is Detective Rodriguez from the FBI. We have 12 more victims who have come forward since your case broke. Your courage has given them the strength to speak out. Each call was validation that everything I had sacrificed, everything I had worked for, had been worth it. The FBI investigation moved quickly. Webb's financial records revealed a pattern of payments that stretched back over 15 years. The forensic analysis of the court records showed systematic manipulation of evidence in dozens of cases. It wasn't just about the 4 women who'd been framed for embezzlement. Webb had been taking bribes to influence outcomes in all kinds of cases. 3 weeks after his arrest, Webb agreed to a plea bargain. In exchange for a reduced sentence, he provided names, dates, and details about the entire corruption network. The information he gave led to the arrests of 6 more people, including 2 other judges, 3 prosecutors, and a handful of defense attorneys who had been part of the scheme. The day of Webb's sentencing, I sat in the same courtroom where he had once destroyed my life. But now he was the one in handcuffs, facing a federal judge who looked at him with the same contempt he had once shown to innocent defendants. Marcus Webb, the federal judge, said, "You have betrayed every principle of justice you swore to uphold. You have destroyed innocent lives for personal gain. You have corrupted the very foundation of our legal system." Webb's sentence was 15 years in federal prison. No parole. No early release. At his age, it was effectively a life sentence. As the bailiff led him away, Webb looked at me one last time. There was something different in his eyes now. Not fear, not anger, but what looked almost like relief. The burden of carrying those secrets for 20 years was finally lifted. But the consequences of the scandal went far beyond Webb's imprisonment. The state attorney general announced the creation of a special task force to review every case that had been handled by Webb and the other corrupt officials. Over 200 cases were reopened for investigation. 47 people who had been wrongfully convicted were exonerated and released from prison. Elena led the legal team that handled many of these exonerations. Watching her work, seeing her dedication to justice, made me prouder than any business success ever could. The state legislature passed new laws requiring financial disclosure from all judges and mandatory recording of all court proceedings. They created an independent oversight board to investigate allegations of judicial misconduct. They established a compensation fund for victims of wrongful conviction. But perhaps the most meaningful change came from my own work. I expanded my foundation to focus specifically on helping victims of judicial corruption. We provided legal aid, financial support, and counseling services to people who had been failed by the system. We funded research into preventing corruption and supported legislative reforms across the country. The first person we helped was Maria Gonzalez, the woman who had called me after Webb's arrest. She had spent 18 years in prison for a crime she didn't commit. When she was released, she had nowhere to go and no resources to rebuild her life. Our foundation helped her find housing, provided job training, and supported her while she got back on her feet. 6 months later, she called to tell me she had found work as a paralegal at a legal aid clinic. "I want to help other people like us," she said, "people whom the system failed." That became our model. We didn't just provide financial support. We helped victims become advocates, turning their pain into purpose. 2 years after Webb's arrest, Elena came to me with an idea. "Mom, I've been thinking about running for district attorney," she said. I want to make sure this kind of corruption can never happen again." The irony was beautiful. The 5-year-old girl who had watched her mother being led away in handcuffs was now planning to become the top prosecutor in the same county where I had been wrongfully convicted. "You have my full support," I told her. Elena won the election by the largest margin in the county's history. Her campaign slogan was simple: justice for everyone. In her victory speech, she talked about growing up believing her mother was a criminal and how learning the truth had shaped her commitment to reform. "My mother taught me that justice delayed is not justice denied," she said. "Sometimes it takes 20 years, but the truth always wins in the end." 3 years after Webb's sentencing, I received a letter in prison mail. It was from Webb himself. "Mrs. Chen," the letter read, "I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness. What I did to you and the others was unforgivable. But I want you to know that seeing your courage, seeing how you rebuilt your life and used your experience to help others, has given me something I thought I had lost forever: hope that redemption is possible, even for someone like me." The letter went on to describe how Webb was using his time in prison to help other inmates with their legal appeals. He had started a program to teach basic legal skills to prisoners who couldn't afford lawyers. "It doesn't make up for what I did," the letter concluded. "Nothing ever could. But maybe in some small way, I can spend the rest of my life trying to balance the scales I tipped so unfairly." I never wrote back to Webb, but I didn't throw the letter away either. It reminded me that even the worst people are capable of change, given the right circumstances. 5 years after that terrible day when I was first arrested, I stood in the same courthouse for Elena's swearing-in ceremony as district attorney. The same building where my life had been destroyed was now the place where my daughter would work to ensure justice for everyone. As Elena took her oath of office, promising to uphold the law fairly and without bias, I thought about the journey that had brought us here. 20 years of struggle, of fighting, of never giving up on the truth. In her first speech as district attorney, Elena announced the creation of a wrongful conviction unit dedicated to reviewing questionable cases and preventing future injustices. "Justice is not just about punishing the guilty," she said. "It's about protecting the innocent. And as long as I hold this office, we will never stop fighting for both." The applause was thunderous, but all I heard was the voice of that 5-year-old girl who had once asked why her mommy had to go away. Now she understood. And now she was making sure it would never happen to another child. Today, I woke up in the same house where this story began, the small kitchen where I once lived as a frightened ex-convict with $53 to my name. But everything has changed. Elena's daughter, my granddaughter Sophie, is 5 years old now, the same age Elena was when I was taken away. But Sophie will never have to wonder if her grandmother is a criminal. She knows I'm the woman who fought back against injustice and won. This morning, Sophie helped me water the plants in my garden while Elena prepared for another day as district attorney. In 5 years, Elena's office has exonerated 32 wrongfully convicted people and prosecuted 15 cases of official corruption. Chen Technologies has expanded into 12 states, providing software solutions that help people navigate legal and social service systems. But more importantly, our foundation has helped over 200 victims of wrongful conviction rebuild their lives. Webb died in prison last year. The official cause was a heart attack, but I think he died of something else, the weight of finally facing the truth about what he had done. In his final letter to me, which I did read, he wrote, "You were stronger than all of us, Mrs. Chen. You never let them break you, and in the end you broke them instead." Yesterday, I received a call from the White House. The president wants me to serve on a national commission on criminal justice reform. At 70, I'm not sure I'm ready for Washington politics, but Elena thinks I should do it. "Mom, you've spent your whole life fighting for justice," she said. This is your chance to make changes that will help people across the entire country. Maybe she's right. Maybe this old ex-convict has one more fight left in her. The judge may have frozen when he saw me that day in court, but I never stopped moving forward. And I never will.